It actually is my very first visit to Odisha, which has played a great role in my imagination growing up. But to be physically here is a very special experience. And thank you all for being here this evening. I also want to say how deeply moved I am to hear Udayan's account, especially in the way in which he annotated very specific experiences of what it means to have something that is ananga or nagna, and how one breathes some sort of spirit into it, but also these experiences of temporality and attention. And I'm thinking of how notions of laya, for instance, come into play. I mean, these are not easily translatable concepts, but they animate our arts. They seem to speak to the experience of producing something that is ephemeral, but is in the context of eternity. And how do you balance that paradox? But I also want to say that we have a great deal of common ground. So I'm going to plunge into what I have to say now. And I think I'll begin by saying simply that this question of the dialogue among the arts, the question of what a Kala-Setu might be, and again, your belief, Jagannath, in the transformative power of art is something that we need to be summoned back to, because it is a very powerful call. And what I want to try and do here briefly is to look at how the dialogues among the arts and in the contemporary moment, whilst indeed so much is shared, the dialogue tends not to happen because the arts have meanwhile gone through very different histories of their own. And those histories, which are histories of also of institutionality, can produce their own differences, their own problems. Also, I want to say that I'm speaking here really as a practitioner, as a poet, as a translator, as a curator. So what I have to offer really is not a grand overarching theory or a model, but it's really more like a toolkit, a set of concepts or tropes or inquiries or themes that I've found useful in dealing with some of these questions. So I'll begin really by also looking at a world of affect and growing up, which for some reason I've tended not to think about very much before. Because whenever I speak about the arts, I tend to speak more about the abstractions, the ideas. And increasingly in recent years, I've realized that many of these crises or questions that come up have their origins in very early experiences for me. And I'll spell out some of those. So that part of it, I hope you'll indulge me, is memoiristic. I grew up actually in a family environment that was very receptive to various arts. My parents made no distinction between the ability to respond to the paintings of Jahangir Sabawala, Hussain, Souza, Tayyab Mehta on the one hand, but also to understand everything that someone like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay had achieved, the textile art of India, the arts that we unfortunately tend to derogate as the crafts. So at home, there was this wide spectrum of imaginative enterprises that were cherished, and I was brought up with that large palette of art. Later, as a teenager, I was fortunate to come into the ambit of Nissim Ezekiel, the poet and critic who was my guru. And Nissim, again, was someone who had this 360-degree understanding of the arts. There was an openness to very different sorts of languages of art making. But when I went on then to become a critic and to find, so to speak, my institutional place in the world of criticism, in the world of the arts, I realized that I was being obliged, or if you will, even instinctively forced, to take sides somehow. In a debate, which I increasingly think is completely misconstrued, between something called tradition over on the one hand and something called modernity over on the other. And for me, as I look back, I think about how I began with this much wider, broader, all-embracing understanding of imaginative enterprises, but then had, for institutional reasons, to make some kind of decision as to which side of this divide I was on. And it's taken me many years, many decades actually, to think these questions through and to see if they really have any relevance, but also to recognize the damage, the conceptual damage that we do to ourselves by continuing with these notions. And I'll spell out some of these things as I go along. Yeah? So that was in the nature of an overture. I want to move now to a small reflection about the interconnectedness of the arts, how the arts might be a garland, and I'm going to invoke one of the texts that Udayan did, which is, of course, the Vishnu Dharmottara Puran. We know that it was an encyclopedia. If you look at the Vishnu Dharmottara, it actually is a vast production which takes in geography, cosmology, but also the relationships among the arts. And as Udayan beautifully pointed out, it shows us that you cannot practice any one art without having a working sense of many of the others, and they therefore are a totality in some ways. So that to me is one ideal of how the arts are in fact intimately interconnected. I also want to position next to that a notion of the totality of the arts that comes from a very different world, which is the world of theater, the world of opera. I'm thinking here of Wagner's notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is often translated as the total artwork, but that might be a bit of a mistake. If you look at the German, Gesamtkunstwerk is actually, there's a notion of a collecting together. Sammlung is collection, it's bringing together, it's gathering. So in a strange sense, the Gesamtkunstwerk for Wagner was a way in which you could produce a polyphony of the arts, how you could, even in the moment of theater, bring in music, the visual arts, sculpture, a whole set of artistic approaches that would enhance and augment the consciousness of the viewer and to be, in fact, a transformative experience in such a way that what you were viewing, what you were experiencing, actually became another reality into which you stepped. So it wasn't merely entertainment. It wasn't a little time that you took from your normal life. It actually was a heightening of the senses. And to that extent, it was an enchanted, a liminal, and even a ritual moment, I think. So I would position these two possibilities of what happens when you can actually gather the arts together. But unfortunately, in the actual doing of this, and this is probably one reason why no one has actually achieved a Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, the trouble is that we do not approach the arts only through the medium of affect, through the intuitions, through an understanding of what is ontologically shared. We actually come to the arts through the pedagogies that we've gone through. We come to them through the training and the discipline, the riyaz, the sadhana, the academic programs, whatever it is that has made us subjectivities that are concerned with the arts. And it's in those programs, those protocols, that a number of conceptual problems come up. So I want to briefly annotate some of these, and I hope these questions will come up during the panel discussion. The first of them, and I alluded to this earlier, is this misconceived debate over tradition versus modernity, which in one form or another continues to inhabit what we do. It has very real consequences, for instance, in the way in which Jangar Singh Sham, who was referred to by Udayan, or Ganga Devi, will at best be referred to as other masters. And although biennial curators or museum professionals have often created situations where they can hang alongside so-called contemporary artists who are metropolitan and academy trained, you still have to make that distinction. There is very often a lack of a level playing ground. There's still some notion that certain kinds of art are traditional or folk or rural or whatever derogatory term and limiting term that we want to apply to them. And we adopt the sovereign position of the metropolis, the academy, often Anglophone education. And that's a division which we need to really question and look at very carefully. I also wonder if we can look at this tradition versus modernity question in a slightly different way, because what is also being suggested is that tradition is static and modernity is the dynamic principle. This is a completely ahistorical understanding of these questions. The fact is that tradition is always a special form of modernity. It's a snapshot view of processes that are continuously, of processes of experimentation and improvisation that continue. notions of musical form or what we understand to be classical dance, we know that some of these have emerged from 19th century processes of modern self-consciousness. They've involved research, they've involved going back to reclaim certain parts of our sculptural history. They've involved processes of textual research. So in no sense is tradition something that has been left in a time warp. Tradition has its own momentum. And if you want to look at modernity, I mean, how far is modernity really premised on a clean rupture with the past? I mean, the key trope of modernity for many of us is rupture and the idea that we're beginning afresh, Ezra Pound, make it new. But the same Ezra Pound returned to classical Chinese poetry. He went back to Latin verse. He had a vast, even cosmopolitan understanding of the classical resources of the arts. So wherever you look in the ground of the modern, there's also a form of ricorso, a recursion, a returning to earlier and prior sources. So it's time we abandoned these unhelpful, unproductive distinctions because they prevent us from seeing how we really work as imaginative subjects. And they also, to that extent, contract and diminish what is possible for us to do as artists. So that's the first sort of reflection I have on what the problems are in practically getting the arts to be a garland or be in dialogue. Another and more practical, pressing, and urgent issue is the fact that every art has a different specific ratio of materiality to abstraction. The fact is that every art has to respond to the cry of its own medium. It has to work with its own archive of gestures, its own repertoire. And how does one translate among the arts? So I'm also going to construe this as a question of translating across the arts, because a dancer has a certain archive of muscle memory, a certain set of texts to rely upon, a certain situation. An artist, a contemporary artist, by contrast, is working with an institutional history that involves the Museum of Modern Art, that involves the White Cube, that involves questions of the dematerializing of the art object on the one hand and a reclamation of classical painting on the other. The debates for each art tend to be quite different. So how do artists within one art convey that to artists working in another? Music, meanwhile, has its own issues, and I'm thinking here of my friend and colleague T.M. Krishna's recent work on Carnatic music, where he's dismantled and deconstructed the classical form of the Carnatic concert and shown how that actually corresponds to very strong economic constraints of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It has to do with availability of venue, it has to do with the time available to an audience in a certain kind of modernizing society. So there is nothing sacrosanct about these things. But how do you take that notion of a dynamic debate within, say, Carnatic music and make that relevant to someone who's still battling issues of how to make art in public space? Or what might it be to choose between an installation and film? Or at what point does video become film? These are extremely pragmatic material questions that are grounded within each art. So how do you achieve that? And here I'd like to suggest that the key word that works for me in this context is something I draw from Sanskrit Theatre. It's the notion of abhijnana. Abhijnana, as you all of course know, is a recognition, which is not a simple recognition, it's a recognition. It is becoming fully possessed of something you knew but had for some reason forgotten, but through signs, tokens, through something half heard or half seen, you reclaim it in a certain way. And I think that dialogues among the arts might actually work beautifully if we use abhijnana as a kind of technique, where it's through things half apprehended, through the glimpse, through the brief darshana, that you see where you might actually produce that bridge, that Kala-Setu. And you don't start with a protocol of how to share and how to translate. You have to be able to be attentive to these brief moments where you think you've seen something in common, and then you work with that. So for me, the occasion of collaboration is really not the key occasion at all, quite often. I mean, I'm as ready as anyone else to celebrate collaborations among practitioners, but I feel that very often we tend to rush into the occasion of collaboration. I think what we really need to do is to step back and to think through for ourselves new vocabularies. We need to do away with some of the vocabularies we inherit with their implicit politics, arts, crafts, modern, traditional, immaterial, material. We need to get rid of many of these vocabularies, and we need to find new ways of talking about what we do within the arts and how to get that across. And in this, for this as an example, I'm going to cite something that comes from a book that my wife, Nancy Adijania, who's a cultural theorist, has just published after years of research on the work of Navjot Altaf, who's an artist who began as a leftist, as a feminist, but then devoted herself to working with colleagues in Bastar, colleagues who came from what Nancy calls the subaltern sections of society. The tribal artists who were connected to what, again, using colonial terminology, we call a tribe. But through this process of working together, Navjot and her colleagues, among whom Raj Kumar is one, achieved precisely something like this. They created common ground by actually drafting a new way of thinking through and talking about their work. And in the book, there's a wonderful moment where Nancy asks Raj Kumar. At that point, they'd received funding from the IFA, from the India Foundation for the Arts. So Nancy asks Raj Kumar, says, what does a word like collaboration mean to you? It's, for one thing, it's English. For another, it comes with a certain history of grant making, Ford Foundation. It has an origin in the entire neo-imperialism of funding and aid. So Raj Kumar said, well, at first it was not a word that worked for us. It was not our language. It felt clunky. And then on being probed further, he said he reached for a term that came out of local social practice. It's Bhartiya, if I remember it correctly, which is a form of people getting together over a meal and sorting out their differences. And then he said, and this is what for me represents hope in this situation. He said he thought it through and said that was also not a solution in terms of finding a new vocabulary for what this act of working together was. Because he said that belongs to its own social context. We're doing something new here. And then he invented a new term, and that term this is the artist Raj Kumar's own term. It's Akal Bata Bati. It is the sharing, production and sharing of Akal, which Akal, Arabic word which cannot easily be translated, but you all know what it means. So, you know, to me, this represents hope at a range of levels. It's someone from a subaltern, disenfranchised background who has not had opportunities and entitlements, but who has the agency, who has seized the agency to name his own activity. And in a still largely feudal, casteist society like ours, that act of agency is an extremely powerful and compelling thing. You name what you're doing. You don't take a name that's given to you by a funding agency. You don't simply co-opt something that's already there, but something new is made. And I think it's that we need to think about. I mean, how do we make these new vocabularies? And in the same context, I'd say that one way of achieving the Kala-Setu is not by, as I said, moving towards occasions of collaboration, but thinking instead, and I draw on another musical analogy here, but thinking about how we could produce ensembles of different kinds of practitioners coming together, different kinds of reading circles. How do you bring together a library of very discrete, dissimilar texts? How do you work towards creating a new curriculum and then working on the outside with it and then injecting it into existing academic institutions? How do you transform the studio? What is a studio for different kinds of practitioners? And how does it change on impact with very different kinds of practices? Is it a nomadic space of making? Is it a space that is like an accordion? I mean, how do we reimagine the studio? So from my point of view, I think the questions that we are asking can also be embodied in these very, very material sorts of inquiries. And I thought I would simply share some of these thoughts with you. Thank you so much for your attention.